I don't even know where to begin. Masters of the Air has just come to an end, and that was definitely the most emotional episode of them all. We finally got to see the real faces behind the characters that were on screen and see the stories of what happened to them after the war. You know that if this was released 10 or even 20 years ago, we'd have the Band of Brothers or the Pacific-style interviews that appeared before the episode, and it's a shame just because so much time has now passed that no members of the 100th Bomb Group are alive. Spanning from February the 3rd, 1945 to May the 1st, 1945, this final episode in the show focused on the last few months of the war. It had the Allied forces closing in on all fronts, celebrations, but also deep reflection on people that had been lost. So with that, let's jump into this final episode and break down all that there was to take away from it. Here is Masters of the Air Episode 9, Ending Explained. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Rosie's final combat mission. This final episode opened up on February the 3rd, 1945, which had Rosie flying over the skies of Berlin. There was a great moment in Kroz's narration where he said how the 8th Air Force flew uncontested and were the true masters of the air. This was something which was quite inspiring to listen to. When you think back to when there were shots like this in the earlier episodes where they weren't flying uncontested and there was death and danger every moment, to now this, where they were quite literally up there on their own, it showed the progression that had been made. Death and danger was still present, but just in a different way, as we went on to see. During this flight, there were some great moments from a visual perspective. I really loved the shot where we followed the bombs being dropped out of the plane. The way the camera just tracked them and we were almost dropping with them towards the target, it was a gorgeous shot to look at. Once they were up in the air, we saw that the plane was hit on multiple different occasions, and 2 of Rosie's crew members were killed. As a way of ensuring that the surviving members made it out okay, he tried to navigate the plane out of Berlin so that they didn't land there, and he also kept the plane level so that the rest of the men could escape. It was once they were out that Rosie then made the jump and headed towards the ground. Once landed, he realized he was in no man's land, which was east of the old river between the lines. Judging by the way that Rosie was acting, it seemed like he couldn't move his arm to grab his weapon to protect himself. But when the soldiers that were headed towards him were getting closer, he stated that he was American, and it turned out that it wasn't Germans that were approaching him, it was members of the Red Army, and after he confirmed that he was American, they saw him as an ally. The events of this flight were in line with what actually happened in real life. Rosie's final mission was part of a 1,000-plane raid, which is why there were so many planes in the sky when we saw the aerial shot. 2 of Rosie's crew were killed due to suffering a direct flak hit, and whilst the plane was in flames, he continued to stay with it until the payload was dropped on the target, and then until the rest of the crew had managed to bail out. It was when the plane was at an altitude of only 300 meters that he managed to get out of it before it exploded, showing that he put the lives of his crew above his own in that moment and was prepared to make sure that they got to a position where they'd be as safe as they could possibly be. Then, once he landed, he was found by the Red Army and returned to duty afterwards. For this mission, Rosenthal earned the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the 2nd highest military decoration in the United States Army. So I feel like the opening section of this episode did a great job at staying true to what happened and telling the story in a spectacularly engrossing way. Rosie was a true hero, and this scene really got it across. The Evacuation of Stalag Luft 3. When the show resumed after the title sequence, we saw that at the Stalag Luft 3 camp, the men were told that they had 30 minutes to get themselves ready and then they were going to be marching. They didn't know where to or for how long. Obviously, now we know that they were marching to Spremberg, where they then eventually got transported to Nuremberg. During this time, the Germans were destroying everything that they possibly could and were burning all evidence of them ever being there. From there, we saw the men walking through extremely cold, harsh, bitter and unforgiving conditions, which consisted of snow and ice-cold temperatures. They were 20 miles from Stalag Luft 3, and that wasn't even half of the journey that they were going to be doing. The Germans wanted the prisoners and themselves to evacuate the camp because the Allied troops were closing in on it, and the Germans knew that they were close to getting caught. What I found particularly interesting in this moment was that we saw the prisoners feeling the effect of the cold, but we also saw the commander of the camp and also the guards going through it too, showing just how much they didn't want to be caught and captured and face conflict. So much so that they were willing to put themselves through the bitter cold conditions in order to have a chance of surviving, because they didn't want to face what was on the horizon for them. Whilst the men were walking there were people that were on the side of the road frozen to death. This was something that was also the case in reality too. During the evacuation in real life, on the first day, the Americans lost their first man, and many of them were going missing or making a run for it. Some were even just giving up and lying down in the snow. There was a moment which was quite a powerful one, which was when Solomon, a Jewish man whose fear was amplified for obvious reasons, helped one of the German officers who was in the camp when he fell down due to suffering in the conditions. A couple of episodes back, this same guard pointed out that Solomon was a Jewish name and there was a sense of him noticing that he was Jewish. Whereas now, Solomon, the Jewish person, was actually helping the German guard who took a distaste towards Jewish people. During this march as well, we also saw that whilst there were still some Germans that had the fight within them and the belief that they'd be victorious, many of the men had lost morale. Even the wounded soldiers that were coming back didn't respond when the guard spoke to them, showing that the morale was probably etching towards its lowest and hope was getting lost. Whilst the men were resting, they arrived at Bad Muskau and were in the German labour factory where they rested for the first time. It was here where we saw Buck and Bucky reflecting on their friendship, but also their time during the war and how they wouldn't have done it differently if they could have done. It does make you think though, doesn't it? If they hadn't have got shot down when they did and made it to Stalag Luft 3, then they may have ended up going up again and eventually being killed in the air. As being part of the percentage of returns from the bloody 100th wasn't necessarily a guarantee. This resting period is something that did actually happen. They rested there for 30 hours, where it's said that the conditions were so bad that the straw mattresses were infested by bugs to the point where they could have moved themselves. After that, the next day, the men were transported to Nuremberg, where they were then walking through the heart of Germany, and it was in complete ruins, showing the destruction in the light of day. With children going up and asking for food and seeing a mother fishing beneath the rubble, it showed the effect that it also had on the civilians at the time that once called that place home. From there, the boys were taken to Stalag 13, where Buck bumped into somebody that he once knew. An escape was something that was always on the cards for Buck and Bucky. Bucky had even been thinking about it long before the evacuation process was taking place, but they agreed not to attempt one at the start of the march due to the harsh conditions. But once they were transported from Stalag 13 and were walking through the road to Bavaria on April 2nd, 1945, Buck managed to escape with two others. However, Bucky wasn't able to escape with them as he was seen by the German guard, something which meant that for the first time in a long while they were separated and they didn't know the fate of each other. The escape was made possible due to the fact that there was general chaos that was present and it made it easier to slip away. One thing that we did see during this time as well was that whilst they were marching during the night, Allied planes would be flying up above and targeting them because they didn't know that they were prisoners of war. All they saw were the lights from the smokes or the flames from the torches and presumed that they were just German soldiers, so it was a danger being on the road at night out in the open. When following Buck during his escape, there was a moment where there was a wounded white horse that was roaming freely whilst it was injured, and Buck stopped to look at it. White horses are said to be symbolic of freedom, so I feel Buck seeing it in that moment was telling of the fact that not only was he going to be free, but Europe was about to be free from the grasp that Germany was trying to have on it. When George, Bill and Buck were resting and on the cusp of making it to freedom, there was a moment that was like what was seen in All Quiet on the Western Front. If you've seen the film, then you'll know what I mean, but I won't spoil it. However, in the context of this show, George was killed right on the cusp of freedom by a bunch of kids. Inexperienced kids that didn't even know what they were doing, walking around with weapons that weren't even loaded. This was a sad moment because he was so close to making it back home, but he died in the forest where they rested. It was later on in the episode in the Bavarian countryside where Buck was then found by the American soldiers that were in the town, and he was sent back to Thorpe Abbotts where he was reunited with Crosby and Rosenthal. A moment that was just joyous to watch and did nothing other than put a smile on my face. The excitement that was present between them and the happiness that they all had was something which just translated across the screen. Buck was now safe, something he hadn't been for months, and it was just amazing to see that. Buck taking a dollar bill out of his box and putting it in his pocket was like a way of him just feeling that little bit closer to home after being away for so long. But that still left Bucky with the rest of the prisoners, but we'll get to that in the section where we talk about the liberation of the camp. Rosie's journey home. With Rosenthal evacuating after flying over Berlin, he had to find a safe passageway back to England, and this was facilitated through the help of the troops that found him. During his journey back, one of the most powerful scenes in the episode came from when Rosie went past Zabikowo. This was a camp that was used as a place to keep arrested people during investigations and interrogations, and if people were found guilty and were awaiting sentencing or execution, they'd be kept there too. People would often be sent out to concentration camps from Zabikowo, and it was rare for somebody to ever be released from there. As the car approached the vicinity, the smell of death was in the air, quite literally, as many of the men were putting a cloth over their face so that the smell would be masked. As Rosie walked into the camp, he saw bodies just lying there in horrific conditions. Plus, there were many that looked as though they'd been burned, something which the Germans did before leaving. Just killing the people and trying to dispose of whatever they could. It's just horrific. As Rosie was walking around, he came to see that many of the people that were there were Jewish. Rosenthal was in fact Jewish, but I don't think it was ever mentioned during the show. The only time that we saw that he could have Jewish heritage was when he spoke to the man in Yiddish in this episode. This scene with the man was actually a really powerful one, and it choked me up a bit. We found out that this elderly gentleman saw his wife, daughter, and grandchildren, along with many people in his village, getting killed, and he had to bury them in a hole. Something that he didn't want to do, but he picked up the shovel because he knew that if he didn't, he would have been killed. He said a line, "Not even the earth that covers our bones will remember us." This was such a powerful line, and one of the most powerful in the entirety of the show. Because at that time, I imagine the idea of being forgotten, the horrific treatment of these real people, family members being killed and not remembered could have been a thought that ran through their minds. I personally found that to be such a moving, emotional piece of dialogue, especially because now, almost 80 years on, we still look back on what happened and the people who had done no wrong but were being killed. We still remember, and I think we always will. After Rosie had left the camp, we saw him arrive back in Thorpe, and again, everybody seemed to be happy to see him. But whilst he was driving back, there was a moment of reflection that was in his mind. I feel this was the image of the camp that he couldn't shake from his head, knowing what had been going on and just how evil the enemy were, something which carried through into his conversation with Harry. Kroz quoted Nietzsche, who is a German philosopher, who said, "Whoever fights monsters should take care not to become a monster himself, because if you gaze into the abyss gazes right back into you." This was Harry reflecting on the killing that he'd done and how he felt as though he couldn't even recognize himself in the mirror anymore. This was when Rosie didn't directly discuss what he saw, but you could tell that he was thinking about it when he said how he felt as though they deserved what was coming to them and that they were monsters. The Liberation of Stalag 7. After Buck had escaped the march, the rest of the prisoners were taken to Stalag 7A, which was the largest prisoner of war camp in Germany at the time. This was located in Moosburg in southern Bavaria. The dynamic of the guards and prisoners was slowly changing as the episodes went on, mainly due to the fact that the tides were turning in the war. So, for example, when these men arrived at the camp, they weren't even processed properly. During this time, a P-51 started attacking the towers in the camp, which is where the guards were located. But this caused a chain reaction of the guards then firing towards the prisoners, showing the type of evil monsters that they were. This was due to the prisoners cheering every time the P-51 would go past and destroy parts of the camp. With the guards turning on the prisoners, this then meant that the prisoners all turned on the guards, and they were severely outnumbered in this case. Stalag 7 supposedly had 75,000 prisoners in there in the January of that year. And with liberation on the way, the mindset of the prisoners changed as they started fighting back. Buck was on the hunt for an American flag to replace in the center of the camp, and whilst cheering was taking place, the flag was put up, and Buck reflected and saw that as his moment of realization that he was now safe, free, and he could return back to England. When it came to the liberation of the camp in real life, a short battle commenced between American tanks and German soldiers that were retreating. Many of the men surrendered, and so did the camp's 240 guards, hence why we saw that moment taking place in the episode. The ending. The ending of this episode focused on the aid that was being given to the Dutch people, but there was still a slight risk that was present as they didn't know if the German troops would honour the truce. Rosie and Buck went up together with Kroz, which I thought was a nice full circle moment. Rosie said how it was an honour to fly with Buck. However, by that point, Rosie had completed many more missions than what Buck had, so I imagine the honour was on both of their sides. On their return, Bucky was speaking over the comms as they were approaching the landing, and we saw a reunion taking place amongst the four of them. Bucky even saying to Kroz, "Are you still being sick back there?" was a moment which did make me laugh. After this, we heard Churchill state how the war was over and that the Germans had surrendered, and this was then followed by extreme celebrations. However, amongst the time of celebrations, there was something where even as a viewer, I just felt like you could sense the loss and death that was present in the room. Many of the men who started there were no longer there, and it didn't feel wrong to celebrate, but there was just this constant undertone of sadness. I suppose that's what bittersweet is, and you could sense that with Buck and Bucky as they were on their own. The final thing we saw in the episode was all of them getting ready to go back home. It must have been strange leaving the place where you've been the past few years, a place where you could have quite literally gone up in the air and never returned. Buck was going back to Marge, Croz was going back to Gene and his son that was born, and all of the other men were returning home. The last shot that we had was of all of the planes in the air for the first time with no threat whatsoever taking these men home. It was quite literally the perfect shot to end this show on, back up in the air but in a completely different context. They knew where they were landing and they knew that they were going home. Overall review. I thought this final episode was a really good one. It touched on the emotions well, and I found myself just being in awe of the real people that this show was based on. Like with Band of Brothers and like with the Pacific, you can't help but see these people as real heroes and just question how they managed to do it. There wasn't much action in the air in this finale, but I don't mind that. We got an amazing opening section which focused in the air, which looked incredible and was structured so well. And instead we got to see the characters struggle and fight to get that freedom that they fought for. Yes, the show was called Masters of the Air, but it didn't need to be about just being in the air. It was about the people who were the Masters of the Air. I would say that I feel this show fixed what the Pacific got wrong when compared to Band of Brothers, which is the transition of time. I feel it was felt heavily in the Pacific, which I think went against it slightly. And although it was felt in this show and in the final episode too, it didn't feel as jarring or disconnected as its predecessor. Band of Brothers handled it the best and it just flowed so smoothly. None of the other two shows have been able to replicate that. Buck, Bucky, Rosenthal and Crosby really did steal this show and are connected with each of the characters in completely different ways. They all performed so well and the casting was just spot on. I do wonder if there will be another Spielberg war piece in the works. I hope there is. But I suppose having a trilogy does give it that conclusive feel. The final few moments in the episode of having the photos and the stories of the real people that were behind the characters was such an amazing way for the show to finish. Seeing their stories and finding out what they went on to do after the war allowed it to have that real sense of resolution. I'll end by saying, what a show this was. It was just simply incredible. So, there you have it, Masters of the Air Episode 9, Ending Explained. I just want to say a massive thanks for tuning into my breakdowns of Masters of the Air. It's been a really great show to cover, and it's been amazing learning about these real-life heroes and seeing them depicted so well on screen. This is the sort of show that does just make you sit there in awe of the real people that fought to protect the freedom of the world and reminds you that they should never be forgotten. I've always appreciated and been grateful for what they did, but after recently rewatching Band of Brothers and Masters of the Air and learning about these real people, it just makes you have a newfound appreciation and respect. Just to let you guys know as well, I've also been covering Band of Brothers, so if you want to see my breakdowns on that show, then head over to the channel. I've done the first 3 episodes and I'm planning on getting episode 4 out in the next couple of days. It's been a pleasure guys, and I'll see you on the next show that I cover that you're tuning into.